The United States is often described in lofty terms, an aspirational idea that we, the people, strive towards. But is it a democracy or a republic? Why can't we seem to agree on a common, universally shared American story? And when did the story of America begin? Was it 1619 or 1776 or earlier or later? Why is this important? Here to examine and discuss foundational and transformational moments in American history in search of answers to these questions in exploring the American story are history professor Dr. Phillip Payne and JES Scholar-in-Residence Dr. Andrew Roth. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spigan. I'm the vice president at the JES and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Before we get to the discussion, a bit about our guests. Dr. Phillip Payne is professor of history at St. Bonaventure University, where he joined the faculty in 1998. Dr. Payne teaches a wide variety of classes on post-Civil War United States history and courses in digital and public history. He is the author of Dead Last, The Public Memory of Warren G. Harding's Scandalous Legacy, and Crash, How the Boom and Bust of the 1920s Worked. You can learn more about him by visiting historyprofessorpayne.com. Dr. Andrew Roth is a scholar-in-residence at the JES, where he facilitates the Ramey Fellows program, authors his weekly book notes series, and is featured regularly at JES programming with his The American Tapestry Project series and American Holidays History series. He also hosts the American Tapestry Project radio program, which airs on WQLN Public Media in Erie with episodes available on the NPR One app. For more information, or before joining the JES team, he had a storied career in academia, serving in leadership roles, including that of president at Notre Dame College in Cleveland and St. Bonaventure University in New York. Folks might recognize tuning into programs. I immediately went into my default longer bio for Dr. Roth, which is certainly deserving. I'm going to encourage you to head over to our website, jeserie.org, to read that. Then again, to learn more about Dr. Payne, head to his website, historyprofessorpayne, PAYNE.com. I want to welcome our live audience, both those attending via Zoom webinar, as well as those watching on Facebook Live. Now, typically, we're asking attendees to ask us questions. While we're still going to be doing that, you can use the comment section on Facebook and the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. We're also going to be posing some questions to the audience, some of the things we'll wrestle with here in this program. We'll be asking for your reactions and thoughts there too, the comment section on the Facebook post, as well as the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. And of course, if you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this event, still send us your questions, your comments, and your reactions to keep this conversation going. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming JES programs and publications, visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Payne, Dr. Roth, thank you both for joining us for this timely discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Happy to be here, Ben.
Excellent. So as I noted, Dr. Roth and I are going to jump in after a context setting presentation that Dr. Payne is going to offer. We're going to turn things over to him for that brief presentation to set the stage for our discussion. Dr. Roth and I will jump in. We'll be asking some questions from you, the audience, along the way. I'll be monitoring that Q&A section and that comment section on Zoom and on Facebook, respectively. Dr. Payne, over to you. What is the American story?
That is the question of the moment, isn't it? Or at least one of the major questions. So this topic is one that I've been thinking about a while, and in some ways, this session we're doing goes back to when Dr. Roth was the president of St. Bonaventure University, and we sort of fell into these discussions. And he went down this path, and he starts this excellent American Tapestry podcast. And I had been teaching a class on the culture wars. And one of the things I wanted to do in that class is like help students discuss things, these deep divides we have around culture in like a better way, like not cable news way, like actually kind of get into the topics. But a lot of that class also deals with the symbolism of what it means to be an American and how difficult that can coming to an agreement on that can be. The other part of this I'm going to bring to this is that I teach these U.S. history surveys, which are very familiar classes. Most people have some version of this if they're educated in the United States, either in high school or in college. So over 2 semesters, I start at the beginning of American history and end at somewhere more or less kind of where we are now. The problem I'm running into is since I started teaching these, we've added like another 25 years to US history. So I keep kind of running out. It keeps getting harder to get it all in. Used to be if I got to the Reagan years, I was really pleased with myself. And now, so that kind of dates things. So what we want to do tonight is just kind of walk through and have this conversation and think of this as an opening conversation of what the American story means. And we do have some audience participation set up, and I hope everybody on the webinar jumps in on this, or at least has some questions that Ben can relay to us. Might be a little awkward given the 2 or 3 layers of technology between us, but I prefer to think of it as an opportunity to do this using the technology rather than the technology being a hindrance. So with that, and I'm going to try to make this not too crazily long a presentation. One of the things I wanted to get at in my presentation is sort of the idea of history versus history. And the reason for this is history as a word has a lot of different meanings, right? And we have this topic of historiography, which is how people think about history, how historians and philosophers think about what is history, how do we know history, how do we know evidence. But I'm going to try and give this kind of grounded into relatively straightforward definitions that I hope help explain partly what we're talking about when we talk about history wars and cultural wars, and why so often we seem to be talking past each other. So one category, which is on my left, so I've got it under social memory, parentheses, history, culture. Sometimes this gets called public memory, is history as it kind of functions in the wild. And I have to preface this by saying, I don't think this is necessarily bad, or I don't mean to denigrate it. I'm just saying these are 2 separate things, because sometimes the tendency among academics is to get upset with popular history. So this is the history that Lincoln referred to as the mystic chords of memory. These are the social memories, the collective identity, the stories we tell each other that help us understand who we are as a nation, as a community. And we all have these. And I would argue these are, in fact, really important. So one of the things I did in my Harding book was look at the presidency as sort of a cornerstone in that sense of national collective identity, but look at it through the lens of how do we remember a president who didn't fare well, in the case of Harding, as opposed to the tendency to sort of look at the sort of great presidents that we idealize, like George Washington. So these stories create a sense of community, a sense of identity. And it's not so much important that these stories have a lot of details or are deeply grounded in evidence. It's more like what they mean to a people, to a person. So these stories tend to be stories that teach a lesson, that have a moral to it, that are applicable to the community, and tend to deal in those things in a way that are timeless. Whereas academic history, what I do, getting a PhD, all that sort of stuff that I did, that tends to be grounded in archival research. It tends to be grounded in the academic disciplines that came out of the Industrial Revolution. And among academic historians, we often talk about history as an interpretation based on the evidence, in which we are essentially arguing with each other, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in not good ways, over what that evidence means. And we tend to focus in on complexity, change over time, context. So we're engaged in this discussion around those issues. And you can see I'm describing 2 very different things sometimes, and they both have they're both history, right? So we're using the word history to describe both of them. So and I'll pause here. Dr. Roth, you want to hop in, or we're good?
No, I'm listening. Although I have a couple of questions for later.
All right. Do we want to do them now? Or we're going to press on?
Well,
you just look like, as far as I can tell through Zoom.
In terms of social memory and academic history, I think one of the things that has, I'll say something provocative in some ways, is that history in its culture building function is almost too important to be left to academics. But on the other hand, you need the validity of the information academics can provide to make sure that whatever you're saying publicly is at least somewhat rooted in accuracy. And I know there's a whole argument there. I've been given a lot of thought about the American story and how you combine these two things that you have up here. A lot of people are quite wary of, and I'm wary of, the notion that perhaps you need to put a template over it and talk and tell a communal myth, what Plato called in the Republic the noble lie, that almost every society's history is too complicated. And this is going to sound horribly elitist, and I don't mean it that way. I just mean it that it's too complicated and too nuanced, and you need to somehow simplify it in order to have the culture cohere. But of course, what happens in the simplification is either a kind of witless glorification or the opposite, a witless demystification. So finding the balance between the two is really intrigues me.
I completely agree with everything you just said, and it really becomes, as we're going to see like in the presentation, but more on the social memory, the social history side of things. A lot of the contest becomes like, who gets to define that? Who right. You know, who makes those selections? Because this, you know, I was trying to, as an academic, trying to describe that in sort of academic clinical terms, but these can become hotly contested and deeply rooted in people's sense of who they are.
And I think, and not to make this too specialized a conversation, one of the things that happened in more my lifetime than your lifetime, but actually in the generation just ahead of me professionally, is that academic historians for a time, and to a certain extent continue, stopped being storytellers and became social scientists who, and any number of people's famous phrase, I'm sure you've heard, Jill Lepore uses it in a couple of places, and I'm drawing a blank on the person at the moment of the fellow who made the famous presentation at an American Association of American History presentation, American Historical Society, on that increasingly academic historians have become so specialized that they, you know, the cliche is they know more and more about less and less, and have lost the sight of the forest for the trees. And what the public needs is some kind of coherent macro description of the trees to organize themselves around, and that they don't absolutely need to know every tree or the moss that might be growing or the fungus that might be growing on any tree. And so how you balance that has become a really interesting struggle.
Yeah, that's a struggle I go with every time I teach.
I think you tell me, I may be getting the alphabet soup mixed up, but the Francis Parkman Award is given, I think, by the American History Association, correct? It's for the best book of it. Yeah, it's for the best book of the year. The irony is that the person who it's named after, if you submitted any one of his books, they wouldn't qualify anymore because he tells stories. And of course, he has a bias, of course, a very, very obvious bias once you catch on to it. In fact, he would not even deny that. He has a thesis and he's arguing it. So I think it's a very important slide, because a lot of the contemporary culture wars that are going on now is, on the one hand, people don't understand that history is not fixed, that it is, you shared with me, and I want to be quiet here and listen to you, but in any event, we'll pick up on some of that later.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's the whole narrative issue is just deeply fascinating, and I'll move on here because otherwise, because we've only got an hour, you know, we got 30 hours of content. But I personally am very deeply interested in the storytelling and the narrative part of it. And when I was in grad school, you were really discouraged from telling a narrative. Like if a book reviewer said your book was a narrative, that was a negative. But I'm wondering if that's changing now, because we're seeing so much literature.
I had the same experience, and I had the same experience in graduate school. I wrote a seminar paper on the Gordon riots in London, in the 1760s. And I got more than an acceptable mark, but the professor wrote on it, you write like a journalist.
Right. So, well, let's move on, because we've opened an enormous can of worms and we got to get some audience reaction. So here's the audience participation, having spent twice as long on that slide as I thought, but that's good. So Ben can relay this on. So I'm just asking these questions. I'm going to show a series of images. And the question is this history, yes or no? And then also, and again, we got a layer here. So if this doesn't work, I'm willing to move on. But I'd really like to get some impression. And then kind of like, why? Why is this history or not history? So here's the first one's a little obscure, not crazily obscure, but a little obscure. Do we have any? Give everybody a minute to respond.
And while we're taking our time, friendly reminder for those joining us via Zoom webinar, this would be the Q&A function for you to use there to communicate to us your reactions to this photo. For those folks tuning in live on Facebook, hello to those saying hello to us. This is the comment section we're asking you to use. So go ahead and drop us a line, your reaction to this photo as we discuss, and then move on to the next. So as we're gathering that, I would say it looks as if this is living history. And in fact, we're getting a comment to that effect, that it looks like we're looking at living history, and people are asking about the paintings that we are seeing both to the left and to the right, slightly cut off there by the screen's image. I'm not sure if that helps folks comment differently, but Dr. Payne, we're looking at what we're looking at and trying to get a better look at it.
That's the one picture I got. See, that's just interesting, because I would have focused in on the two documents in the center. So this is the Constitution and the Declaration in the National Archives. So I would go with living history. I think that's a legitimate thing, but it's also like a temple. I always like this example because we set this up, like if we think about our stories and our stories as part of our identity, that this is literally one of our temples to democracy, where you go in and you pay homage to, and there is a narrative in this thing, to go back to your story, because you could walk by those paintings, and it's the painting set the stage as you reach up and reach the sort of altar of our republic.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Payne, let's go on to the next image. Take a look at what we're looking at here.
All right, these.
Give folks a few seconds to respond. Take a look at what's on the screen. Friendly reminder, if you're on Zoom webinar, the Q&A function. If you're on Facebook, the comments section. And of course, too, a big thanks to folks for participating along. This is the first time we've tried something like this in a digital arena. Going back to what Dr. Payne said to begin with, we are using multiple media here to be able to have this conversation. And while it might seem daunting, it's also exhilarating and exciting to find a new way to connect with people. Our first response in on this slide is academic.
Yes, this is definitely academic history. I would say personally, these are three of my favorite. These are three, I guess I should say favorite. These are three seminal academic titles. At least two of them, I probably would argue, three of them have reached a broader audience. Like Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's A Midwife's Tale is just I think a brilliant piece of scholarship, and has reached a large audience, been turned into a documentary. So it is kind of bridged that gap that we were talking about. And it's getting a little long in the tooth now. It's 26, 27 years old. But James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom is a truly impressive synthesis of the Civil War, of bringing, telling the Civil War story in it's like 700 pages, which my students are always like, wow, that's a big book. And I'm like, I got the whole Civil War in one book. So.
And to think about one American moment about which many books have been written. We're seeing more in the line of academic. I think that's our theme here. So Dr. Payne, can you take us on to our next image?
All right, these.
Again, we're going to pause for a moment and allow for audience to react on Facebook comment section. and Zoom webinar in the Q&A function. And of course, a friendly reminder, if you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this, you can still interact on this Facebook post, but you can also send us correspondence, jeserie.org. You'll find it there to keep this conversation going, because I think he said it half jokingly, but I'm taking him seriously. Dr. Payne said we've got about 30 hours of content, which means we can turn this well into a series to discuss. It looks like film history to me is one of the responses we're now getting in the comments section. So film history is where we're going right now.
I would. That's pretty good. I mean, these are also all one version or another historical fiction, so going back longer than film. But I mean, if you think about, like, one of the first things people did once they could sort of mass produce film, like film was sort of becomes a viable industry, not just the technology exists. They start making Westerns in the United States, right, which is a form of history, if you will. And they make, now I'm drawing a blank. This is super embarrassing. The movie about the Klan during Reconstruction.
Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation, right?
And
That's the first feature-length film.
Learned that in the American Tapestry project
Right.
series. We've covered that there, and taking a look at it. Dr. Payne, I'm going to jump in with one other comment. We have Popular, and in fact, somebody in the comment sections on Facebook caught us and helped us there with that film as well, also acknowledging Birth of a Nation. So thank you, commenter. But Popular is the other reaction that we're having here in terms of looking at what we're looking at on the screen right now.
And I've lost all credibility now, having blanked on the Birth of a Nation. So
that's okay. That's why we have folks watching on Facebook to help us out, folks watching on Zoom webinar to help us out as well. We've got the three of us. Let's go on to the next image and take a look at what we might see there.
I was going to throw out real quickly. I think that the Steven Spielberg's Lincoln is actually in dialogue with Birth of a Nation. I think it's a repudiation of it. And we can, if somebody wants to come back to it, we can come back to Hamilton or the other ones. All right, these.
All right, and one more friendly reminder, folks, comment section on Facebook and the Q&A function on Zoom webinar, and taking a look at what we're looking at right now. And of course, later, if you're viewing or listening to this, still send us your comments, your questions, your thoughts. So we're looking at a lot. We've got 4 images here, and I think folks are gathering their thoughts and reactions to it. Our first one that comes in is monuments, trying to find one word that ties them all together, and that's our first response. And then our second one is public art and public artistic is what we're getting here for another comment. So monuments and public art.
I would go with both of those. I think these are commemoration. Another word we use as synonym for history. And this is actually, I think, one of the flashpoints between academic history and sort of the public's view of history. Because like this comes up a lot in conversation with me, and people say like, well, they're taking down statues or taking down history. Like I've had that conversation with my mom. I'm like, no, they're taking down a statue. History, if you want history, go read a book. But then that's also on my part, a very academic answer, right?
Well, I think that goes right at looking at the public response. You know, we can see it publicly versus having to go and do something much more intimate, which is read a book. You know, something much more private, a one-on-one relationship with the material in front of you. Another person says commemorative for this, and we have a comment here that's a bit thicker that I want to take a chance to read and share with us. It says, especially in the light of the 1619 project, and I know we're going to get to when do we decide the story of America begins. That's one of the things we're going to talk about. So we might be preempting that slightly, but maybe this is a natural way to be thinking of it early and telegraphing that, especially in light of the 1619 project and the advanced coursework discussion of critical race theory. To what extent was the founding of the country influenced by the already existing slave trade? And in what ways can the governmental form be amended to create a more just government and a more perfect union for all? Big questions there, which I know we're going to work to get to, but we can put that on everybody's radar as a way to think of what we're going to talk about as we continue on. Another commenter says these are ways to remember great moments in history. That's their comment in reaction to what we're looking at on the screen right now, these 4 images.
Yeah, this is also kind of creates a sense of the timelessness of that event, whatever when you build a statue to something like out of stone like this.
I would also throw in another word, and this kind of goes back to the very first slide from the National Archives. These are iconography,
Yes.
which is commemoration, but maybe at an amped up at another level.
Well, and they're
particularly
also
like the Jefferson Memorial has, almost not almost strike almost. It has very obvious religious overtones, even though it's quite obviously Greek in style. But it's a temple.
Yeah.
It's
a
I'll jump in here with one
Republic.
more. I'm going to jump in here with one more comment from our viewers on Facebook. This person's noting should be remembered in context. And I think that's what we're talking about, these public displays of the context of how they're being displayed. And I can't help but think of a conversation that we've had in the American Tapestry Project a couple of different times. And Dr. Roth, we can maybe pull this thread, pun fully intended, later. But the idea that a lot of the statues and monuments erected aren't erected immediately following the Civil War, that's during the Jim Crow era and much later, and that context is so important to knowing why something's there and how something was constructed. Okay, I want to ask Dr. Payne, can we move on to the next?
Yep. Well, yeah, we'll leave time. So I'll make this the final one, get some quick responses.
And folks, keep it coming in the comments section on Facebook and the Q&A section on Zoom webinar. Looking at now 4 different things on screen again, looking for your reaction, your comment. What do you think when you see these images? And of course, if you're watching a later broadcast of this, still chime in. You can read those other comments that are on Facebook, but we still want to hear your reaction as well, looking for what you see here as we take a look at this. Attempts to clarify history is our first response.
I also think these are also people who are translating academic history into popular history. You see that.
We have one more response as well that I'll toss out so we can discuss 2. So we have 2 on the table so far. One is attempts to clarify history. The other, the new one, is more than one side to history, which is one of the things that I know we wrestle often with. And is there an American story, the American story, or is it American stories plural? Do we have more than one? One person says Howard Zinn light is the response also to what is on screen.
That's a good one. And yeah, I almost put Howard Zinn up here. So yeah, although I don't know if Dan Carlin would buy that, but that's if you want to figure that one out, you can ask Dan Carlin. So all right, I'll move on. So we're getting so we have time for some Q&A. So basically this all comes down to the power of narrative, right? And one of the ways we want to think about this is that stories have beginnings, right? Like this is, so if you think about the story of the United States, it has a beginning, it has a middle, right? And here I've chosen the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution, sort of the middle-ish period of the 19th century, which of course, if that's the middle, then that implies that somewhere along the line, we need to have an end. And I would actually argue in our popular culture, we spend a lot of time wondering what the end of America will be. Like that is like you could just, especially in dystopian science fiction, like that's everywhere. So anyway, Planet of the Apes and Independence Day, for those of you who aren't in the movie buffs, aren't movie buffs. So let's so this goes on to our slide about just, so what we've talked about so far is a fairly streamlined history of America, right? Like we had, the beginning, the American Revolution, we come to an end. It's fairly straightforward. We look at the sort of icons that make the public impression of that. But then you find out, like Ben was just saying, like this actually gets incredibly complicated really fast. And you see that reflected in our evolving commemoration and icons of the nation, right? The physical history around us as we navigate what it means to be an American. So if they may kind of comment this, or do we want to go ahead to the when does it begin thing?
So yeah, so are we asking the question now of do
Yes.
we want to focus on, is there more than one story, or do we want to focus on
Right.
when do we begin that story? Dr. Payne, I can't help but see those. I don't know how to untangle them myself. If we're looking at trying to figure out our origin point and wrestling with multiple origins, I think then it begets the idea that there are multiple American stories, and I think this is one of the things that Dr. Roth wrestles with so well, is how do they all weave together, even if they are independent threads, how do then they weave into one story that we can see that may be a collection of more than one story. So I myself, I'm not sure I can see divorcing the two questions and looking at an origin point and then looking at, whether or not we have more than one story. And going back to an earlier comment in the comments section, we do have, one person was suggesting that, and we just got a new comment saying we learn more versions of the same story as more voices become amplified. And so now I think we're looking at the layers of the story. And Dr. Roth, I don't know if we're making a three-dimensional tapestry now where we're layering it on top, but I see where that person's coming with the idea of looking at more versions of it to maybe see it clearer. And I think this might be the old eye test when we go to the optometrist and we're seeing the lenses in front and we're adding more and more, and suddenly we can see more clearly.
That's a really good metaphor, Ben. Actually, we might be in 4 dimensions because it changes with time, and time works in both directions. And is there more than one story? I think there's obviously more than one story. So the question becomes, what, if anything, holds them together into some kind of coherent narrative? And one of the things that's going on in American culture is, at the moment, right now, is we've lost some agreement on whatever that common thread would be. And the interesting point about that is there probably has never been an agreement about that. There have been different candidates over time. Samuel Goldman just wrote an interesting book, After Nationalism, and he does a really good job of, in a very succinct, relatively speaking, succinct. That book's only about 140 pages long or something. He talks about 3 attempts in our history to come up with a unifying story. The original one was the Covenant, coming out of New England, which is this was an Anglo-centric white Christian Protestant culture. That broke down under the pressure of 19th century immigration. And it also broke down under the pressure of the fact that it was never completely accurate. There were Catholics in Maryland, there were Quakers in Philadelphia, there were Germans and Swedes and Scandinavians in the middle Atlantic states, or the Jerseys as they called them then. And actually there were Englishmen in Virginia and the Carolinas who disagreed vehemently on just about everything with their New England brethren. And that's, of course, because that was founded by an aristocratic Anglican culture as opposed to a dissenting culture. So that broke down. And then under the immigration in the 19th century, and I'm not going to give you the whole thing, we end up with the melting pot notion, which worked for a while. Theodore Roosevelt liked it as long as everybody melded into an Anglo-American. But that broke down when people decided they weren't going to be that. And then we had the creed, which we can talk about later. So the other thing that's interesting about it, and Phil's the one who introduced me to it, I tend to agree with, when I think about history, I tend to agree with John Lewis Gaddis's metaphor of history, that history is actually like a landscape that continually is coming into focus. And of course, Gaddis goes to, John Gaddis, he goes into some detail on it. For one thing, history can never be the historical story, if you want to call it that, the his story can never actually be one-to-one to reality, because you couldn't take it with you. That wouldn't even work as a map. Even maps are abstractions. He uses that metaphor. So by definition, history is not reality. It's not exactly what happened. It's an account of what happened that is continually being refined and coming into sharper focus. So think of that metaphor of the simplest way to summarize without getting into the esoterica of it is, think of it as looking through a camera where you're continually adjusting the focus and seeing more and more. I think it's a fascinating question. Actually, I've been devoted about the last 2 years of my life wrestling with this, so I'm going to be quiet because I got about 80 things going through my head at once. And when that happens, I usually end up talking gibberish.
So Dr. Roth, wrangle them in, find the thread to rope them all around. Dr. Payne, I'm going to come to you in a second because I know you want to respond to that. But also what I want to offer up is another comment that I think is speaking at what we're talking about and speaks to it, what we're talking about. And this person is pointing out different events affect various populations differently, but we only hear the accounts of those in a position to speak on them. And to me, I think simply put, it's you know, he who holds the power holds the pen, and those that have the ability to tell a story then begin telling the story. And it's not until power is redistributed or equitably moved, or there's not even a power equation in this, that multiple people can then lend to the story. But that's what that person is saying, is that in fact, somebody just quoted Winston Churchill, put it in the comments section, history is written by the victors, you know, and that's the idea here, is that there are multiple ways of looking at this, and one singular moment in our history affects different people very differently, yet we may only capture that one moment through one vantage point, because those people are those who have the ability to write the history, to capture the moment, to tell the story. So the louder voices, those in power, can do that. I wanted to add that. Dr. Payne, over to you. I know you wanted to respond to some of what Dr. Roth was saying.
The commentator sort of stole my thunder there a bit, but yeah, I mean, I think a part of it is, when we're looking for this story of America, right, is one, I'm not sure we ever come to a story, and two, it's what the person said. It's like, who has the power to speak, to inject their voice, their part into this broader narrative, right? And that's why I mean, from my opinion, I think that a lot of this is going to actually take place in the venue of popular culture, right? Like, it's like if you think about, and then that becomes like, who gets into the popular culture, and who has the power to shape our view of history and nation in that. And I'm using the term popular culture like to mean mass media, mass culture, right? Like, like the power of, say, Westerns to make us think of what it means to be an American. And I think that's why it's so important to have these new icons, these new symbols, these new stories appear in things. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by this, and we'll move on to the conclusion. Is, and I didn't put this in the presentation, but if you've seen the HBO series Watchmen, which is actually a show just about historiography. It's about how do we know who we are, and how do we understand change over time and our role in it. And it starts with the Tulsa race riot. They're very, very, very vividly told, like a story. I could never match that in terms of vividness. But if you look at one layer under it, it's actually the Superman story. It's the immigration story, because the mirror of the kid escaping from Tulsa basically escapes Tulsa just as Superman escaped Krypton. So I would think a lot of the discussions going to take places like that. So.
Well, and I think that a brilliant point, and I can't second you enough. It's hard to match the power of that storytelling and capturing. And I'll add this note before we advance to the dates. I remember when that series came out, I had several friends, colleagues, folks that I'm connected to, had not known about Tulsa before that came out, and then to think about the pop culture movement helping us to relearn our history that has existed. It's been there for a century, and yet folks are unaware of it. And yet through popular culture, we're introduced to it. And I think just talking about pop culture, we can't also ignore, and maybe this is one of the questions we'll get to after the dates, thinking about how we do use mass media to communicate now, and the impact that that's had. The fact that so much is socially experienced on social media, and the fact that we're hosting this program on a social media platform as we speak, and people are interacting with us. But those don't have the guardrails that TV has, for instance. The vast wasteland speech was never said for social media, yet we had it for the FCC and for TV regulations. Let's move along to the the dates, because I know this is an important part of the conversation too, and we want to save some time for the Q&A from the audience as well, welcoming in folks there. So Dr. Payne, take us over to the next slide.
All right, so here's and we're running out of time just a smidge here, so I'll try to like basically get to the point here. And the point being is, when we're doing this, you should having this discussion. How do we? I have this. I think about this every time I sit down to write a syllabus for the new semester. What goes in, what goes out, what choices I'm making. Am I conscious about this? And one of the ways I think about this, and I've done this in class, is what do we use as a beginning point, and what does that say about our narrative, right? So this is kind of what we're throwing out there. And if somebody wants to feed into the comment section some dates they think of as good beginning points, and then I've got some that we came up on the next slide. So we'll see how this works. This is a little bit of an experiment here.
Yeah, and so as folks are populating that, I'd remind one of the earlier comments pointed out the 1619 project, and that data has come off of our tongues before in this presentation. And of course, we looked at documents around the founding of the country. I said earlier in the intro, asking the question, is it 1776 or is it 1619? So those are two we have so far. Folks watching on Facebook, when do we begin the story of American history? That's the question we're looking at. So chime in on that, folks watching Zoom webinar Q&A function. Let's get some ideas from you. When do we start if we're looking to tell a story? And stories have those three basic parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end. How do we pin down the beginning, especially because the beginning's already happened? Even though we might be preoccupied with that end, we're not there yet. The beginning has happened. History has happened already. When do we start? What dates do we come up with?
And I'm really missing having a chalkboard.
So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to talk to Zoom about getting a digital chalkboard.
They have that whiteboard function. It just hit my, like, oh, we should have set that up.
Okay, so we should do that next time, because again, we've talked about, we have 30 hours worth of content to get through. So for hours 29 and down, we're getting the chalkboard out.
So what other dates do we have? So 1619, 1776.
So folks are a little quiet here. And I wonder if that's because this is a heavy question to ask. Right. When do we begin? Because I think that even by putting out a date, and I'll use one for instance and pull it off, and off the board here and say, 1492, and I want to contextualize that with, that's not necessarily the year I believe the American story happens, but that's one I remember being taught in elementary school when I was growing up. That's the discovery of America. And the word discovery there is not just doing heavy lifting. It's inappropriate, I think, now when I deepen my knowledge of how would we discover a nation that's already populated and already here. And so we would have to talk about that, which we can for hours on end, of what that means. But I remember, as a child learning that and being taught that, and then learning much later that it wasn't necessarily a sing-song version of Columbus arriving to the Americas that I might have been led to believe at that point. So folks, feel free to chime in. One does say, a person did just back me up and said 1492.
Right, and more than a few history textbooks have started with Columbus sails the ocean blue. I remember singing that song in grade school.
Well, in fact, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first attempt to write a comprehensive American history was Bancroft, right? And he took it back to 1492 because he wanted to give this new young nation. He wrote in the early 19th century. He wanted to give this new nation more gravitas, so he took it all the way back.
And then also, if you think
Columbus
about,
didn't discover America.
Right, and Columbus,
he never landed on the North American landmass.
And whatever,
he wouldn't have known what that word meant.
The United States isn't even close to existing at the moment we're talking about. But
I'll get us a little closer, because we do have some folks weighing in. One person says the first, and they put first in quotes, the first settlement was in 1607. But so much was already happening here before that. And I think that's at the heart of what we're getting at, which is the heart of what the next person has responded and says it's impossible to give one answer, but this is an interesting conversation. And I think that's what we're wrestling with here, is that it's impossible to give one answer. But there we have another number off the board. We've already mentioned another one, 1619, with the idea that that's the first time that a people is brought upon the land not of their own volition. And in fact, we bring African Americans here, via slave trade.
Right.
But yet we still have other mile markers in the 1600s. We have another one.
Yeah, we could do 1629, Massachusetts Bay Colony, a city upon a hill, right? Like the whole Puritan riff, the Thanksgiving riff, which is in itself kind of an origin story.
And we see that
Yeah, in fact,
with 20th
that's what-
century, we see that with 20th century implications, with
Mhm.
Ronald Reagan calling the shining city upon a hill. And
Oh, so-
Dr. Roth, I'm going to take the words out of your mouth, because I know we've talked about that before in other programs.
I'm simply going
I
to point
just
out.
wanted to throw in, Phil said that stories have you and Phil were talking about stories have beginning, middle and an end. Another way of thinking of it is exactly the same. The stories that endure actually or they tell you they have three parts. They tell you where you came from, and then how and where you came from informs who you are and how you are to live now, and that actually then gives some hint to where you're going into the future. So they do those three things. So I think this is a really important question Phil's posed, and I agree with the one person in the audience that it's practically impossible to pick a date. But if you pick whichever date you pick, changes the narrative. So, for example, Annette Gordon-Reed says in her recent book Juneteenth, she plays around for about several pages with this very notion we're talking about, and she ducks 1619, but she does point out St. Augustine, Florida was founded in 15 whatever. I'm drawing a blank on the exact date at the moment, but early 16th century. But Annette Gordon-Reed points out, if you say America started in 1629 with the founding of Massachusetts Bay Colony, you get one story based upon the quest for religious freedom. Now, if you drill a little deeper, it was actually religious zealotry who wanted freedom for themselves and not anyone else, but okay, that'll go too far. So you get one that is a group of religious idealists, and we'll leave it at that for the moment. If you go to 1607, you have a group that is very simply, they're avaricious, they're seeking gold, which they never found. And just luckily for them, before they almost died of exhaustion and starvation, they figured out how to cultivate a weed that you could smoke. And then,
so I will point out,
two very different, right there, two very different.
Right. So quickly, I'll point out, at no point in any of the dates we have up is the United States of America even on anybody's radar. Like,
absolutely,
none.
That's the other.
We're talking about the Spanish Empire and then what becomes the British North American Empire.
And I'll jump right in there with
John Winthrop. John Winthrop had no notion whatsoever of anything like the United States. That's
So
in fact, they didn't even call New England New England. They called it the New World.
So I'm gonna jump in with more audience reaction to all of this, and one person saying not a date, but to the indigenous peoples comment, the Iroquois Grand Council is the world's oldest recorded representative democracy, and that was one of the questions that I opened this program with: are we a democracy or are we a republic? That's one of the things that we love to argue about the United States of America. But here, a representative democracy existed on this land before the United States as a formal nation was actually created. That person pointing out democracy had been around here for hundreds of years prior, which goes again back to what I was saying about 1419 of a country already populated by a people, yet here we are talking about that as a significant date. Another commenter says, it all depends on whose America is being prioritized in the selecting of a date. And I think that that's a really astute observation from this person of, and again, I think back to what we were saying earlier, depending on where you start, depends a very different narrative that Dr. Roth was talking about. And one more comment says, and even then, the way the narrative is told all depends on who's telling it. So it's who's being prioritized by the start date, and then who's continuing to tell that story.
And who's getting left out by the start date. Like every one of these start dates we've started assumes the United States starts in the East, starts in the British North American colonies, and moves west, essentially writing Native Americans out of the picture. And then the other thing go ahead.
I was thinking, Phil, just before you said that, the person who mentioned the indigenous people, If you actually wanted to say, when did the story of America, well, I can't even use that word. When does the story of human interaction on the North American landmass begin? We'll just use North American landmass because there's no other shorthand way of saying it. You got to start with the indigenous people. And if you're talking about origin stories, middle passage, and where we are now and where we might be going, but maybe think about this. Earlier this afternoon, I'm working on a presentation I'm doing at Chautauqua, and the new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is the first indigenous person, the first Native American to be the member of a presidential cabinet. And Kimberly Teehee has been named by the Cherokee Nation as their delegate to represent them in Congress. She would not have a vote, and that's still somewhat unsettled whether Congress will even seat her, although the Treaty of Vicota, 1832, gives the Cherokees. So that story, that thread, if you will, submotif, has never stopped.
Right.
But
yeah.
yet, whoever said it, and I think Phil was going there, so I'm going to be quiet and give it back to Phil. All of these dates we're throwing out here write the indigenous people out of it as if they weren't here.
Yeah. And then I would also point out Columbus had his moment when we have a large immigration from Italy, and then Italian Americans wanting to make a claim to being American start celebrating Columbus as an Italian who discovered America. So anyways, let's press on. We're going to run out of time. What about this date? How come nobody's throwing this one around? Like, this seems like, you know, the Declaration of Independence, the American Creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator. Here's the one where we actually get the government of the United States that we have to this day. So if we're thinking institutionally, like the Constitution of the United States, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. So it's interesting to me we're not popping these up because I'm awfully tempted to, like, institutionally, this is when the country actually starts. And then I'm going to throw three more out, and then we got just a few more minutes. The Gettysburg Address. That's when we rededicate ourselves, in the midst of the Civil War. So you could argue the Civil War is actually the rebirth of the country. Like, the United States as we know it, culturally, socially, starts to be forming in the middle of the 19th century. And so I got two more. 1945, the beginning of the American century. The United States wins World War II. We are the hegemonic global power, and we're now going to wrestle not only with that, but with all these social issues we've been that are coming to the fore. The civil rights movement, the women's movement. We start trying to reform ourselves as a nation. And then I threw this one there because Dr. Roth, this is one of his favorite dates. So, is this the date it all came apart? So, or was this like another rebirth? So anyway, those are the dates I came up with. I could come up with more. I think this is just a fun exercise. I don't think any of it's definitive. I think it's just to get the brain flowing. So and I know we got, like, if we're ending at 5, we got like 5 minutes. So we sort of went on quite a bit.
Well, I think it shows one of the words we've used earlier, the complexity of wrestling with what seems on the surface to be a simple question that is exceptionally profound. What is the American story? And then, picking apart, is it story or stories? And then starting to wrestle with, when does it begin? But looking at the later dates there, and as we're opening up, and at this time, folks watching on Facebook, any broader questions for this, things you're interested in exploring and studying, and the same goes for Zoom webinar with the Q&A function. Folks chime in on questions at the end. It's really the complex nature of, is there a story, the stories, and then when do they all begin, and trying to figure out the date. Dr. Payne, I appreciate where you started with 1776, and then in particular 1787 and 89, looking at the actual formalizing of our country, because that, to me, if I'm trying to wrangle in a definitive, it is the definitive paperwork that launches the country that we currently live in and the government we currently have. But I still feel squeamish about that, saying that's got to be it. That's the date. And I think that's what we're wrestling with here, is that we have something that seems like a natural starting point. Is it perhaps because, and we talked about this with all the dates we put up, it ignored the indigenous peoples? Is it because we're picking a date and we just go and say, that's it, clean slate, this is page one, not acknowledging that there's a preface or a prerequisite to America that leads into our starting point if we're using the 1700s, late 1700s as a starting point?
Well, I think that's part of the value, to go back to the point Dr. Roth's making about the what academic history brings to it: context, complexity, change over time. When we're in dialogue with these questions we're talking about, this desire to have a fixed thing that we say this contributes to our identity, right? This is who we are. So I mean, part of it is, the way I end up thinking about it is, when we often have this veneration of the founders, right? However we define that group, we often freeze them in time. We freeze them in 1776 or 1787, and we pretend like James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, or just pick any one you want, right? That they didn't change and evolve and age and come to new opinions and decide that this, whatever they did was right or wrong. Like, we just sort of freeze them in that moment and then like put them in amber.
Going back to the comment section, and I think folks are okay if we extend just a little bit. I know we're knocking on the door of 4:59, so I'm going to go ahead and extend this just a little bit more. I know the class bell's ringing, but this is the final class of the day, so we can hold on just for a second.
It's okay. I've got nowhere to go in a pandemic.
So this person, and I think that actually speaks right to it. This person says, I've seen the social and political complexities of 2020 compared to those of 1968. And I think it'll be curious to see how historians of the future look back on today, because I can't help but think we're living through history,
Right.
and I don't say that lightly, because one, we're living through a once, hopefully in a century, hopefully more than just a century, once in a century pandemic, that there's that, but we also see social unrest, racial unrest, and we see the pandemic exposing a lot of that, shining a light into corners ignored in our history. And it's given us a chance to sit at home and wrestle with these very real issues, these disparities, these inequities. It will be interesting to look, because Dr. Roth, is somebody who studies 1968 extensively. We have the vantage point of the 50 years. So imagine looking at 2020, at 2070, and taking a look at what we're doing now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Also, in the comments section, I think affirming the fact that people are okay with our 30 hours of content, maybe not in this single program. Somebody says, looking like a future series. So folks are excited about this and unpacking. And I've got to thank everybody in the comments section on Facebook and on Zoom webinar. I know we're balancing some media here and working across them, but I really appreciate everybody actually being attentive and plugged in and participating in this. This has been exciting. Another person says, America is not just the history of people coming from Europe. That's
right. So one of the biggest groups to arrive in the British North American colonies are from Africa.
Yes.
Right. And we don't often acknowledge that in our dialogue. And notice, I was very careful about how I chose my words. I said I didn't say they immigrated, but if you look at just the numbers of the British who's in the British North American colonies, one of the largest groups are from Africa.
And right at the heart of that, a person says, some might say that when all men could participate in democracy, August 6th, 1965 Voting Rights Act. So we're putting 65 on the table, and I'd say, in doing so too, we have to look at 1921, when women can finally vote with the passing of the 19th Amendment. And I think that's where we get a chance to look at these transformational and foundational moments in our history, and to see, perhaps both who is now included, but who is still excluded at those points.
So how about the Immigration Acts of 1924 and 1968? So the 1924 Act sets quotas to try to keep the United States population Northern and Western European. And Lyndon Johnson signs an Immigration Act that gets rid of that and sets the stage for in some ways, the huge demographic shifts we're seeing in the country.
In fact, that Immigration Act, Phil, of 1965 or 6, I think it was 65, whatever. One could argue that changed America almost more than any other single piece of legislation in our history.
Yeah, it's certainly very important.
Right.
So I
And
know
one
we've
of the
wrestled-
things we didn't talk about, but in response to the listener comment about who came here, I think his name is Ronald Takaki, wrote a book, A Different Mirror. We never talk, or we rarely talk about those who immigrated across the Pacific,
Right.
and that was a significant number of people even in the 19th century, and it's not a particularly
Well,
it's not a particularly shining moment in our history with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. I mean, the very first, well, not the very first, but one of the first two immigration acts that was ever published was actually an act that ever legislated, passed, was an act that actually slammed the door shut, or tried to slam the door shut. So I'm just really excited and happy that Phil is becoming part of what we're trying to do at the Jefferson. I hope we can talk him into doing some other stuff with us.
Oh, this has been fun.
This has been a lot of fun, and I know we're over time, and folks aren't seeming to mind. Thank you for sticking around. We appreciate it, but I do want to be respectful of when we say we'd end and getting folks on their way. And I think what I'm hearing thoroughly in the comments section and from the three of us is the conversation must go on. And so let's find a way to regather and take a look at that. And folks, I'd invite you in the comments section or to contact us, jeserie.org. What you'd like to see is we talk about the story of America. What is America's story? What is the American story? And I want to end there by asking both of you, based on what we discussed today, if you had to sum it up briefly, what might you say? And I know that's a tough question, so I'll put myself in the tough position and I'll go first. I think what today I heard is, the American story is complex and incomplete. And I say that because there's a lot going on and we still have a lot yet to do. And we're continuing to fold in all of the parts that may have been left to the margins all along. So for me, I think those are the words I hold on to out of this conversation, learning from the both of you that our story is a complex one and it remains incomplete in two ways. One, we're still writing it, we're living through history now, and we're learning how to incorporate people that had been pushed to the margins or maybe even off the page before. I want to go to the two of you. Dr. Roth, can I go first? Your reaction, and then we'll let Dr. Payne have the final word for the presentation. So glad we've had this conversation today. This has just been exciting and energizing, and I know it's tough and hard things to break apart, but I think it's conversations like this that help that. So Dr. Roth, I want to go to you first. What is the story of America? What did we learn today?
As you know, Ben, and as Phil alluded to at the beginning, I really got interested in this. I mean, seriously interested in this with a conversation with Phil. I think it's a classic. One of the reasons universities are wonderful places. It was classic. It was literally a conversation, I think, in a hallway sometime in the fall of 2016. We got chatting about this, and I started thinking about it. And here we are 5 years later. And we've done all this in between. So I want to actually thank Phil for being the spark that got me interested in a lot of this. I think it's really the American story. Much of our cultural conflict, cultural disagreements in the last half century have been disagreements about whose story it is. And different people arguing that it's their story, and one group of people in particular trying to impose their story upon others. That would be a whole other session for us to go into. I tend to think of the American story, as you know, I've used the tapestry metaphor. I think the two major threads is that we have this ongoing, and I'm looking over here on my other screen at Phil's list of the possible dates. So setting aside what date, but if it's the ongoing experiment in self-government, which we have complicated immensely by constantly changing and growing the definition of who's included in we the people. As we try to do two things, I'm not going to say have never been done before in the history of the world, but in fact, they've probably been done any number of times, but that's a different argument. How do you put together a government of the people that is self-government when you constantly are changing who the people are? I happen to be in favor of us constantly changing who the people are and including everyone. But that, as quite frankly, has enormously complicated the challenge that we set ourselves. there are those who would like to uncomplicate it by excluding a whole lot of people. And I think a big part of American history has been those people who have been excluded, or those people who some would exclude, has been those people's attempts to be included by appealing to our foundational ideals. But I think it's actually very important, and this could be a topic for future things, that we do try to arrive at some kind of coherent story, because you need to have, if I were to use a simplistic metaphor of the body politic to the psyche of an individual, you need to have something that brings that together holistically, or what will happen is you fragment. And I'm using that metaphorically, but just as a person could come apart at the seams, so metaphorically, a culture can come apart at the seams. So this is not simply an idle academic question that takes us way back to Phil's very first slide. You know, it's not simply an academic question, but you need the validity of the information that the true scholars can arrive at using their methodologies to inform the public story that you're trying to tell. It's not a fiction, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know. It's a I'm going to stop talking because there's.
So I think you just gave us at least 7 new programming ideas in there. And folks in the comments section, one says, looking forward to future programming on this topic. So folks are excited. So we're going to hold on to that, Dr. Roth. We appreciate it. Dr. Payne, the final word after today's discussion, your takeaways, main points, and a look ahead.
I'm going to say it's, one, I just think it's an interesting topic, and I'm agreeing with everything you two just said. But I guess I think it's also a story, adding to that is a story of reinvention, right? And reinvention about what these terms mean, what these symbols mean. And even though you can kind of put something in, write it in stone, like the Lincoln Monument, right? And there it is. It just sits there and it's seemingly unchanging, you know, for all time, unless you see the Planet of the Apes reboot. But never mind, another film reference. But then meaning of it changes when you have the March on Washington movement and you have a speech on the front of it, right? Like it's sort of in a popular sense, it ties together 2 points in a thread, you know, of the tapestry, to use that, your metaphor, but it also changes the meaning of that physical place somewhat. Yeah. So I think that's what I would add to it. Like this, yeah. Plus, this is all just really complicated. So.
Complicated, complex, incomplete, evolving, changing, renewed, rebirth, a lot we can consider. I just want to thank you both, Dr. Phillip Payne, history professor at St. Bonaventure University, Dr. Andrew Roth, JES Scholar-in-Residence. Thank you for your time, your energy, your expertise, your knowledge, and your efforts in helping us to have the discussion today. And hopefully, looking forward to future discussions tomorrow, not literally tomorrow, but in the future, we'll talk more about the story of America. Thank you both for all you've lended to this conversation. We're grateful for that.
Okay, yeah, it's been fun. Thank you for having me.
And of course, a big thanks to
thank you, Ben. I've enjoyed it. And maybe you're going to do this. If you're going to do this, excuse me in advance. I also like to thank our audience for their participation. This was an experiment we were trying, and it really it's given me a lot of ideas on how to change some of the presentations I do. So I want to thank our audience for engaging.
You took the words out of my mouth, and I wanted to say there's a lot of gratitude in the comments. Thank you. Great discussion. Thank you. Thanks. Looking forward to future discussions. So let's find a way to continue to have this conversation, one that folks are saying in the comment section is much needed. But of course, the folks you watching along at home, we couldn't do this without you. The exchange of ideas and information would not be possible. This has been a fun new experiment with us having this interactive collaboration across media. So we welcome that into the future. thank you for being here. And of course, for folks watching this later, streaming it on demand, we appreciate and are grateful for your attention too. Still, that comment section is open, and you can also contact us at jeserie.org. When you do head over there, you're going to find a whole wide range of publications that you can read, you can download for free, including book notes by Dr. Andrew Roth that touches on some of the subjects we talked about today. In fact, one of his most recent book he mentioned, After Nationalism, is available there, book notes number 69. Do go check that out. Also, you're going to find videos available to stream on demand of past presentations, catch up on other programming, and you'll also see announcements for future programming, including conversations between the three of us and more, as we welcome more people to the table to have these conversations about the American story, the American stories. We thank you for your attention and your time and your participation in today's discussion. Of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagin. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.